Good Wednesday morning, everybody. Welcome on into today's episode of Freight Waves. Now, we're halfway through the week. I'm Kaylee Nix here with Anthony Smith.
That's right, and we're one day closer to that virtual event, which is tomorrow, and you still have time to register. But for today's episode, we'll get to chat with Metaphor's Kevin Jenkins about the compliance report for carriers, and we'll also have our hot seat segment coming up in the next hour. But first, our top story takes us to the nation's capital, where the Biden administration is promoting a new model for getting to a net zero greenhouse gas by moving away from trucks. John Gallagher is here to talk about it. John, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Sounds like John can't hear us, but you know what? That's okay. We'll get him in just a second. Anthony, you mentioned that we've got that virtual event coming on up. I know we're going to talk about it a little bit later. You and I get to host tomorrow. Anything you're super excited about?
So I have a fireside chat or two, and so I'm excited about just the general conversation around the new way of selling, because when we think about selling, there's this, I don't want to say old school mentality, but I think that still runs throughout the industry of, hey, I got to get this guy on the golf course, got to wine and dine this person, I have to do this, I have to do that. But there's also just that aspect of being transparent, that thing that everyone talks about.
Absolutely, and it's not like them olden days anymore. So make sure that you head on over to live.freightwaves.com and get registered for tomorrow's Sales and Marketing Summit if you haven't yet. Rumor has it, we'll be hosting.
That's right, and I'm excited for, once again, we have another giveaway.
There you go, just like the good old days. All right, we're gonna toss things on over to the wall. We've got our first carrier update of the morning ready to go with Tony Mulvey and Donnie Gilbert.
Welcome into this carrier update. I'm Tony Mulvey, joined by Donnie Gilbert. Donnie, we obviously saw volume levels bounce back up to erase all of the holiday impacts. Now we're following those impacts. We did see it move down ever so slightly, but rejection is still trending lower.
So we want to see our volumes over 10,000. So we saw them bounce back up, and they're currently at 10,740. We draw that line at 10,000. Above 10,000, thumbs up. Below 10,000, thumbs down. Well, we're still above 10,000. So volumes are still healthy, on the healthy side, just barely. We do not want to see them drop below 10,000. It's likely to during January and February. And it does that, you know, that's a trend that actually happens. You know, a lot of times it will drop down below that during those months just because it's the slowest 2 months of the year. The problem is our rejection rates are back on the dive here, down to 4.88%. And that's just because there's just too much capacity. And all that capacity entered when there was a high demand back during COVID. So that's expected. And this is going to have to work itself out. It's going to happen probably during the first and part of second quarter of 2023.
Yeah, if you can think of a supply and demand curve, it's got to move that supply curve to the left, drop it, so that's what's going to raise the price and meet where the demand levels are. It's just a matter of how long does it take for that to move in that direction, and obviously we haven't seen it yet, or else this number would not be continuing to fall.
Yeah.
But it's going to take some time. I mean, there's no great gauge to measure how fast that capacity is leaving, but I mean,
nobody wants to leave just because it's either sell out, which right now is going to be a bad time to sell out because the trucks aren't needed, so it's going to be tough to sell your equipment. And number two, it's either that or go bankrupt. Nobody just really wants to go bankrupt either. So those ones that are in there, they're kind of stuck in there, and they probably got very huge payments, and if they're probably heads up on their equipment as well. So whatever they can get for it, they can't pay it off. So they're going to stick with it till the bitter end. Maybe they can make it through, maybe not. If they play it smart, they can make it through this. They just got to be sure and trim their expenses heavily and pick the best lanes to run. Let's go to the next chart here right quick. You can break this down, Tony. The volumes by length of hauls. I've got it written here by the city haul, short haul, mid haul, tweener haul, and long hauls. Of course, long haul is still the highest percentage of loads out there. And here we've got down real tight here are actually the other four. So you need to go in and you can break this down by markets and choose which market you're running out of and see what best suits you. You can also break this down here on the next chart. You can break down the tender rejection rates as well. And you may see that some markets are operating totally different than other markets. Boston's not going to operate the same as Chicago. So, here Boston, 300 miles gets you out of the Northeast. So break it down, see what's going on, and see what works best for you.
Absolutely. Well, Donnie, thank you so much for this update. We'll be sure to check in with you again a little later. Right now, we'll hand it back over to Kaylee and Anthony.
All right, guys, thank you for that. We've got our Washington correspondent, John Gallagher, here. Tech issues worked out to talk a little bit about what's going on for our top story of the day. New and kind of very interesting proposals coming out of the Biden administration. John, talk to us a little bit about this. Does the Biden administration want to get rid of trucks?
No, not at all. But I thought it was interesting. They came out. The administration came out yesterday with what they're calling a blueprint for getting to basically net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And it was put out by it's sort of a joint blueprint. It's like 88 pages, put out by DOT, Department of Energy, Department of Housing and Urban Development, and EPA. So. It builds off. They had a memo of understanding among these agencies last year, and it's also building off the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of the incentives that for getting to cutting greenhouse gas emissions, the funding incentives there. So they put out what they're calling this landmark blueprint, and it lays out these three strategies for getting to that goal, and it's for passengers, commuters, as well as freight. And the three strategies for getting there is increasing user convenience, improving vehicle efficiency, and also transitioning to clean fuels and vehicles. And so it points out that the transition to clean fuels is what is going to drive most of the emissions reductions, but I sort of zeroed in on that second goal, that second strategy within this whole blueprint, which is vehicle efficiency strategies, and because it points out that when you're talking, and this is just on freight side, when you're talking just about freight and the ton miles, that when you measure it by ton miles and freight ton miles, trucks, are not only the largest contributor to freight to emissions. Heavy trucks in particular can be difficult to decarbonize. So to try to offset those numbers on the freight side, the goal should be to prioritize more fuel efficient modes as measured per ton mile, and therefore therefore being cleaner modes like maritime and rail, which have a much less on a per ton mile basis, domestically per ton mile basis, they're much lower in terms of their emissions, and therefore you reduce congestion and you improve travel times. So the chart they put out there was for like medium and long haul trucks and buses. Again, this is freight. They take up 20% of actually the overall emissions, freight and passenger, and aviation takes up 11, or not takes up, but puts out 11% of the emissions, whereas maritime is responsible for 3%, and rail is responsible for 2%. So that's why they kind of they kind of put out this strategy to prioritize shifting even parts of the shipment journey, if you can, away from trucks to rail and water where it's feasible. And the key part of it all is the phrase when they say when feasible, because if you're a domestic shipper and shifting from truck to rail or water may not be very feasible, from a cost perspective, depending on your size and your location. And they sort of acknowledge that. They say, choose the best mode for any given trip is complex, and it depends on available option. But I just thought that. I thought this was interesting and significant that the administration is choosing to document, in this major blueprint, a priority of modes in terms of how to get to their overall zero emissions 2050 strategy. Because there's always this cost, as we know, there's always the cost question for all modes when these modal shifts take place.
Yeah, John, it's really interesting to think about this, right? Because they say maritime and rail are super valuable. And obviously, our rail infrastructure is pretty decent when you're talking about cross-country freight. But maritime is really pretty useful on those coastal areas. And then you have to navigate the inland waterways, which there is this kind of discrepancy over, are inland waterways a decent system to get freight moved inside the country? Obviously, the Mississippi works for its barge system. But how viable is switching to a maritime option for this type of case if you have to really navigate building the infrastructure for really intense inland waterways and then getting people to use it?
Yeah, that's a good point, because they've been the whole short sea shipping inland waterway transition has been they've been trying to incentivize that for years, and it's worked in certain areas, this short sea shipping goal, and getting trucks off the highway and putting onto the water where you can with moving containers, but it's just economically it hasn't been enough to make them any kind of a major change. Now they've been trying to incentivize this also to kind of jumpstart it, and they've put out grants. The Department of Transportation tries to prioritize putting these short sea shippings through the Maritime Administration, short sea shipping options. So it is sort of moving there, but again, they put out this big blueprint, and they say to prioritize where you can, and that's sort of the missing piece of this is the practicality of the whole thing. But we'll see. The infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act was pretty historic in terms of the funding that they dedicated to some of these things. So we'll see. That transition might be coming sooner, rather than later now.
And John, as you mentioned, really with that priority aspect, is there any order of operations outlined here on which issue to tackle first, or is it just all slowly at once?
It's kind of like an all going on at the same time type of thing. And I also just want to point out really quickly, it's not like, and I hope it didn't come across as like wanting to get rid of trucks, but because they do mention in there things that when we do our top 20 tech companies or top 25 tech companies, they actually call out some of those types of companies that are able to improve transportation optimization and increase vehicle routing and improve load factors and cut deadhead miles. They talk about doing, in terms of the trucking mode in particular, they talk about companies that can do that, the private sector that can do that. So and they also talk about better use of real-time data and more real-time demand data, like companies like us that put some of that stuff out. So these things also help to reduce emissions by optimizing these routes. So again, yeah, I just wanted to point that out, that it's not this the point wasn't to shift away from trucks, but those are just sort of the priorities within those strategies.
Awesome. Well, John, thanks so much for outlining this for us, and we'll be sure to keep you on and having us updated as this continues to kind of get, I guess, implemented throughout our nation.
Sounds good. Thanks, you guys.
Right. Head over to Kaylee Nix, who has our first look at today's top stories.
Thanks, Anthony, for that. Here's a look at what's making headlines on freightwaves.com this morning. U.S. imports continue their downward tumble and are expected to pull even with pre-COVID numbers this month and next. The National Retail Federation has officially declared the pandemic-driven import surge over. Estimates show that the top 12 U.S. ports handled 1.88 million TEUs in December, down 10.1% year over year. Descartes reported that imports for all U.S. ports totaled just under 2 million TEUs, just 1.3% higher than imports in December of 2019. Even with this decrease, ocean delays remain higher than they used to be, and the coastal mix is different, with East Coast ports handling significantly more volumes than pre-pandemic. Georgia has ended its motor fuel tax holiday after suspending the taxes last year following the spike in oil prices. The gas tax holiday had been extended on a month-to-month basis since last summer, and now Governor Brian Kemp says he will focus on passing legislation for property and state income tax relief instead. The diesel tax, which had been 32.6 cents per gallon, will increase by 3 cents per gallon as of today. Motor fuel taxed in Georgia are paid to the state by fuel distributors and not by the individual gas stations. The tax suspension from last year is expected to cost the state around $1.7 billion. And software provider E2Open has released its quarterly earnings report, enjoying a strong fiscal Q3, but saying it sees a softer market ahead. The company had its third fiscal quarter end on November 30th of last year, reported total revenue of $164.9 million, up from $137 million a year prior. The subscription services as its software saw its product revenue rise to $134.9 million. E2Open closed on an acquisition of BlueJay in the third quarter of 2021, which led to a net income loss in Q3 of that year. But this year, net income rose to $17.3 million. And you can find details of these stories and more on freightwaves.com and our FreightWaves app. And if you're watching us live, give us a like and subscribe to stay updated. You can do that on social media as well. For the full FreightWaves experience, head on over to tv.freightwaves.com. We'll take a quick break and come back with our first check of weather for the day. The 2023 Freight Tech 25 list is filled with meaningful innovators from across the industry who are helping shape what the future of supply chain will look like. Check out the full list of these companies and all the latest Freight Tech news at freightwaves.com.
Welcome to Drilling Deep. I'm your host, John Kingston.